The desert stretched endlessly under the brutal New Mexico sun, a canvas of bleached bones and forgotten dreams. Jake Morrison rode his paint horse through the shimmering heat, his weathered face squinting against the glare that bounced off every grain of sand. He had been tracking wild mustangs for 3 days, following hoofprints that led him deeper into Apache territory than any white man had ventured in years. The silence out here was absolute, broken only by the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves and the distant cry of a circling hawk. But then he saw it, half buried in the sand, near a cluster of twisted mesquite trees. At first glance it looked like a piece of driftwood, weathered and dark, but as Jake dismounted and approached, his breath caught in his throat. It was a totem, carved from what looked like ironwood, about the length of his forearm and intricate beyond anything he had ever seen. The surface was covered in symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light, animals and spirits intertwined in a pattern that spoke of old wisdom and sacred power. Jake knelt beside it, his calloused hands hesitating before touching the carved surface. The wood was warm, almost alive beneath his fingers. This was no trinket or decoration. This was something holy, something that belonged to a people who had walked this land for generations before his kind arrived with their wagons and their violence. His grandfather had told him stories about such things, objects that held the breath of the ancestors, that carried blessings and curses in equal measure. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling dust around his boots and carrying with it the faint sound of something that made his blood run cold. Voices, distant but unmistakable, shouting in English. Jake grabbed the totem and scrambled back to his horse, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the heat haze, he could see riders approaching from the east, their blue cavalry uniforms dark against the pale landscape. Without thinking, Jake tucked the totem inside his saddlebag and spurred his horse toward the rocky outcropping that rose like a cathedral from the desert floor. He had no business being in Apache land, and he certainly had no business carrying something that clearly belonged to their people. But something about the carved wood called to him, whispered of responsibilities he did not yet understand. The soldiers passed below him, their voices carrying up through the thin air. They were hunting, he realized, searching for something or someone with the methodical precision of men who had done this before. Jake pressed himself against the warm stone and waited until their dust had settled before emerging from his hiding place. The totem seemed to pulse against his leg where it rested in the saddlebag, and he found himself thinking of his wife Sarah, dead these past 2 years from the fever that had swept through their small settlement. Sarah had believed in signs, in the idea that the land itself could speak to those who knew how to listen. She would have told him to return the totem to its rightful place, to honor the people who had carved it with such care. But Sarah was gone, and Jake was alone with his grief and his guilt, and now this sacred object that had somehow found its way into his hands. The sun was setting by the time Jake reached his ranch, a modest spread of buildings clustered around a natural spring that had drawn him to this place 5 years ago. The house was small but solid, built from local stone and timber that had weathered to the color of old leather. He had built it with his own hands, every beam and board a testament to his hope for a future that had crumbled to dust along with his wife's body. Inside, the silence was oppressive. Jake lit a lamp and pulled the totem from his saddlebag, setting it carefully on the wooden table that dominated the main room. In the flickering light, the carving seemed to move, shadows dancing across the intricate surface like living things. He poured himself a whiskey and sat down across from the totem, studying it with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that might save his soul. The symbols were unlike anything he had seen before, but somehow they felt familiar, as if they spoke to something deep in his bones. There were animals. He could see that much. Horses and eagles and what looked like a great bear standing on its hind legs. But there were other shapes too, human figures that seemed to be dancing or praying, their arms raised toward a sun that blazed at the center of the design. Jake drank his whiskey and stared at the totem until his eyes burned. Outside, the night sounds of the desert began their ancient chorus, coyotes howling in the distance and the soft rustle of wind through the sage. He thought about the soldiers he had seen, about the way they had been searching with such grim determination. Someone was missing, someone the army considered important enough to hunt through hostile territory. He was still sitting at the table when the first shots rang out, distant but unmistakable. Jake grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Fire bloomed on the horizon, orange and violent against the star-filled sky. The soldiers had found what they were looking for, or perhaps what they were looking for had found them. The battle raged for what felt like hours, gunfire echoing off the canyon walls and mixing with war cries that made Jake's skin crawl. He had heard those sounds before, during the massacre at Sand Creek, where he had served as a reluctant soldier, following orders that had left him hollow and sick for years afterward. The memory of that day, of the women and children who had died screaming, was part of what had driven him to this isolated place where he could try to forget the taste of ash and blood. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Jake stood at his window, rifle in hand, and waited for whatever was coming next. The totem seemed to glow in the lamplight behind him, a beacon of something he did not understand but could not ignore. Dawn came pale and hesitant, revealing a landscape scarred by smoke and violence. Jake saddled his horse and rode toward the site of the battle, driven by a morbid curiosity and a growing sense that his fate was somehow tied to what he would find there. The smell of gunpowder and death hung heavy in the air, and vultures circled overhead like dark prayers. The scene was worse than he had imagined. Bodies lay scattered across the sand, soldiers and warriors alike cut down in their prime. But it was the sight of the Apache camp that made Jake's stomach turn. Teepees had been burned, their sacred contents scattered and trampled. Women and children lay among the dead, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain that Jake recognized all too well. He was about to turn away when he saw her. A young woman lying motionless beside the remains of what had once been an elaborately decorated lodge. She was barely breathing, her body broken and bloodied, but alive. Jake dismounted and knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he checked for wounds. She was beautiful, despite the dirt and blood that matted her long black hair, with the high cheekbones and proud features of her people. Her eyes fluttered open as he touched her face, dark and deep as mountain pools. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that he could not understand. Jake gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, as if grief had hollowed out her bones. She did not resist as he carried her to his horse, though her eyes never left his face, studying him with an intensity that made him feel naked and judged. The ride back to his ranch was the longest of Jake's life. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow and labored. He found himself talking to her, filling the silence with stories of his life, his wife, his guilt over the things he had done and failed to do. She listened without responding, but something in her eyes told him she understood more than she let on. Back at the ranch, Jake carried her inside and laid her on his bed, the same bed where Sarah had died 2 years before. He heated water and gathered clean cloths, then began the careful work of cleaning her wounds. She had been shot in the shoulder, the bullet passing through cleanly, but leaving a ragged wound that would need stitching. There were other injuries too, bruises and cuts that spoke of a desperate fight for survival. As he worked, Jake found himself thinking about the totem, still sitting on his table like a silent witness to this strange turn of events. Was this coincidence, or was there something deeper at work here? Sarah would have said it was fate, that the desert had brought them together for a reason neither of them could yet understand. The woman's fever broke on the 3rd day, her eyes clearing as she looked around the unfamiliar room. Jake was sitting in a chair beside the bed, the totem cradled in his hands as he traced the intricate carvings with his fingertips. She saw it and gasped, trying to sit up despite her injuries. "Easy," Jake said, gently pressing her back down. "You're safe here." She stared at the totem, then at him, her eyes wide with something between fear and wonder. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but her English was clear and precise. "Where did you find this?" Jake told her about discovering the totem in the desert, about the soldiers and the battle, about bringing her to his ranch. She listened without interruption, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the rough blanket that covered her. "My name is Aiyana," she said finally. "It means eternal blossom. That totem belonged to my grandfather, the medicine man of our band. It was carved from the wood of a tree that grew beside the sacred spring, blessed by 7 generations of our people." Jake nodded, understanding at last why the carved wood had seemed to call to him. "I'm Jake Morrison. I've been living alone out here for 5 years, trying to make peace with my ghosts." Aiyana studied him with those penetrating eyes, seeing past the surface to the guilt and grief that drove him. "You were a soldier," she said. It was not a question. "Once, I did things I'm not proud of, things that haunt me still. Yet you saved me. You brought me to your home, tended my wounds, kept the totem safe." She paused, considering. "My grandfather used to say that the spirits work in mysterious ways, that even the darkest hearts can find redemption if they choose to seek it." Over the following weeks, Jake and Aiyana settled into a rhythm of careful coexistence. She was still weak from her injuries, but she moved through his small house with a quiet grace that transformed the space. She cooked traditional foods with the supplies he brought from town, filling the air with unfamiliar but wonderful smells. She tended a small garden behind the house, coaxing life from the harsh soil with the same gentle persistence she showed in everything she did. Jake found himself watching her more often than he should, admiring the way she moved, the way she hummed softly to herself as she worked. She was nothing like Sarah, who had been blonde and pale and quick to laughter. Aiyana was dark and serious, her beauty deeper and more mysterious, like a still pool that reflected hidden depths. The totem remained on the table between them, a constant reminder of the worlds they came from, and the gulf that separated them. Sometimes Jake would catch Aiyana holding it, her lips moving in what he assumed were prayers in her native tongue. She never asked him to return it, and he found himself reluctant to suggest it. The carved wood seemed to belong here now, in this space they were creating together. It was during the 4th week that the trouble began. Jake was in town buying supplies when he overheard 2 men talking in the saloon. They were describing a woman who matched Aiyana's description perfectly, calling her a dangerous savage who had escaped from the massacre and was hiding somewhere in the territory. There was a reward offered for her capture, dead or alive. Jake finished his business quickly and rode hard for home, his mind racing with possibilities. He could try to hide her, but how long would that work? He could help her escape to Mexico, but the journey would be dangerous, and she was still not fully recovered. Or he could turn her in, claim the reward, and try to forget this strange interlude in his life. The last option made him sick to his stomach. Whatever Aiyana had done or not done, she did not deserve to be handed over to men who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be solved with rope and bullets. She had brought something into his life that he had not even realized was missing, a sense of purpose and connection that went beyond his own grief and guilt. When he arrived at the ranch, Aiyana was sitting on the porch, the totem in her lap and her face turned toward the setting sun. She looked up as he dismounted, and he saw that she already knew what he had learned in town. "They're looking for you," he said, stating the obvious because he did not know what else to say. "I know. I saw the dust on the horizon today. Riders, watching the house." She stood, the totem clutched against her chest. "I should go. I've brought enough trouble to your doorstep." Jake stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "What did you do? What are they hunting you for?" Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "I killed a man," she said finally, "a soldier who was hurting children during the massacre. I put a knife in his heart and watched him die." Jake felt something settle in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying for years, finally finding its proper place. "Good," he said, and meant it. "Some men deserve killing." She looked at him with surprise, then something that might have been relief. "You don't think I'm a savage, a bloodthirsty killer? I think you're a woman who protected innocence from a monster. I think you're braver than I ever was." Jake reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "I think you're exactly who you're supposed to be." That night, as they sat by the fire, Aiyana told him the full story of the massacre. How the soldiers had come at dawn, claiming they were looking for stolen cattle. How they had opened fire on women and children, laughing as they reloaded their weapons. How she had watched her younger brother die in her arms, his blood soaking into the earth that had been sacred to their people for generations. The soldier, the one I killed, he was dragging a little girl toward the trees. She was maybe 6 years old, crying for her mother. Aiyana's voice was steady, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes. "I couldn't let him hurt her. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Jake understood. He had stood by and done nothing once, had followed orders that went against everything he believed in. The memory of Sand Creek, of the women and children he had failed to protect, would haunt him until his dying day. But Aiyana had acted when it mattered most, had chosen courage over safety. "What happened to the girl?" he asked. "She escaped. I saw her running toward the canyon where some of the others were hiding. I hope she made it." Aiyana looked at the totem, its carved surface glowing in the firelight. "My grandfather always said that we are judged not by what we do for ourselves, but by what we do for those who cannot protect themselves." The next morning brought riders on the horizon, a line of dust that spoke of men with guns and hard intentions. Jake counted at least 6 horses, moving with the steady pace of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. He and Aiyana watched from the window as the riders approached, their faces grim in the morning light. "There's still time to run," Jake said. "I can hold them off, give you a head start." Aiyana shook her head. "No more running. I'm tired of being afraid." She picked up the totem, holding it like a shield. "Besides, this is where I belong now, with you." The riders reined in their horses just outside the fence, their leader a grizzled man with the bearing of a former soldier. He wore no uniform, but his authority was clear in the way the others deferred to him. "Morrison!" the man called out. "Name's Clayton. We're here about the Apache woman you're harboring." Jake stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually, but ready. "Don't know what you're talking about, Clayton. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We know she's in there. Hand her over and you can walk away from this." "And if I don't?" Clayton's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then you'll burn with her. Choice is yours." Jake felt Aiyana step up beside him, the totem still clutched in her hands. She stood straight and proud, showing no fear despite the odds against them. The sight of her courage gave him strength, reminded him of who he wanted to be instead of who he had been. "She's under my protection," Jake said. "You want her. You'll have to come through me." Clayton's expression darkened. "So be it. Boys, you know what to do." The riders spread out, surrounding the small ranch house with practiced efficiency. Jake and Aiyana retreated inside, barricading the door and windows as best they could. The totem sat on the table between them, a silent witness to what was about to unfold. "I want you to know," Jake said, checking his rifle and counting his ammunition, "that these past weeks have been the best of my life. Since Sarah died, I thought I was done with living. But you brought me back." Aiyana touched his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. "In my people's tradition, warriors who die protecting the innocent are welcomed into the spirit world as heroes. If we die today, we die with honor." The first shots came from the east, bullets splintering the wooden shutters and filling the air with dust and splinters. Jake returned fire, his aim steady despite the chaos. Aiyana moved with surprising grace, reloading his weapons and keeping watch from the opposite window. The totem seemed to glow in the dim light, as if the spirits of her ancestors were watching over them. The battle raged for hours, the attackers unable to breach the sturdy stone walls of the ranch house. Jake's marksmanship took its toll, and he saw at least 2 of the riders fall. But their ammunition was running low, and Clayton's men showed no signs of giving up. It was during a lull in the fighting that they heard it, a sound that made the hair on Jake's neck stand up. War cries, distant but getting closer, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Clayton's men heard it too, their voices rising in alarm as they tried to locate the source of the sound. "My people," Aiyana whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. "They've come." The Apache warriors struck like lightning, appearing from the rocks and ravines where they had been hiding. They rode with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose, their traditional weapons mixed with rifles taken from fallen soldiers. Clayton's men, caught off guard and outnumbered, broke and ran within minutes. Jake and Aiyana emerged from the house to find the ranch yard empty, except for the Apache warriors, who sat their horses like statues carved from stone. Their leader, an older man with silver hair and eyes like chips of obsidian, rode forward slowly. "Grandfather," Aiyana said, her voice thick with emotion. The old man's eyes fixed on the totem in her hands, then moved to Jake. He studied the white man for a long moment, taking in the rifle in his hands, the way he stood protectively beside Aiyana, the respect in his posture. "You fought beside my granddaughter," the old man said, his English accented but clear. "You protected what was sacred to our people." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. The old man dismounted and approached, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. He placed his hands on the totem, then on Jake's shoulders. "The spirits have spoken," he said. "They brought you the sacred wood, brought you my granddaughter, brought you the chance to choose between fear and courage. You chose well." The old man stepped back and spoke in Apache to his warriors, who listened with grave attention. When he finished, several of them dismounted and began to unload bundles from their horses. "What's happening?" Jake asked. Aiyana smiled, tears streaming down her face. "They're blessing the land. My grandfather says the spirits have claimed this place as sacred, that it will be protected by both our peoples from now on." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever witnessed. The Apache warriors created a circle around the ranch house, placing sacred objects at cardinal points and chanting in their ancient language. The totem was returned to its place of honor, set on a specially constructed altar that faced the rising sun. When it was over, the old man approached Jake again. "You are welcome among us if you choose to stay. The spirits have shown us that some bridges can be built across the deepest canyons." Jake looked at Aiyana, seeing his future reflected in her dark eyes. "I choose to stay," he said. "This is my home now. She is my home." The old man nodded approvingly. "Then we will dance at your wedding when the moon is full." As the sun set behind the mountains, Jake and Aiyana sat on their porch, watching the Apache warriors make camp near the sacred spring. The totem glowed softly in the twilight, its carved symbols seeming to pulse with inner light. "Do you think they'll come back?" Jake asked, thinking of Clayton and his men. "They might," Aiyana said, "but they'll find more than they bargained for. This land is protected now, watched over by spirits that are older than their fears." Jake pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, the warmth of her body against his. "I love you," he said, the words feeling strange and wonderful in his mouth. "And I love you," she replied. "My grandfather was right. The spirits work in mysterious ways." That night, as they lay together in the bed where Sarah had died, Jake felt something he had not experienced in years: peace. The ghosts that had haunted him were not gone, but they were quiet now, their voices replaced by the soft breathing of the woman beside him and the gentle whisper of wind through the blessed sage. The totem sat on the table in the next room, its carved surface telling stories of love and loss, of courage and redemption, of the unexpected ways that broken hearts can heal. Outside, the Apache warriors kept watch, their presence a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. Jake Morrison had carried a tribal totem through the desert, thinking he was simply returning lost property. But the spirits had other plans, weaving a love story from the threads of guilt and grief, creating something beautiful from the ashes of the past. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.